Back again YouTube, and welcome back to the coding workshop. And we're going to just pick up from where we left off in the last video where we're doing our query builder. But before we do that, I want to actually jump back to the query builder factory and do a little bit of refactoring, because as you can see at the bottom here, we're sort of like returning new query builder. But actually what I want to do is just return that variable query builder object. And that should be the end of that. So that's the bit of refactoring that I wanted to do, and I wanted to show you guys, so I'm not doing it off screen, then you see something different on Git. So whatever changes that needs to be made, I'm going to do it on the screen so you can see it, so you can follow along. So I'm going to close that out, and the next bit of our ORM that I want to tackle is the entity part of our ORM. And the responsibility of this section is this is going to be the component that directly what's the word? This is the part of our ORM that's going to directly interact with our database. Like, it's going to do all the CRUD operation, perform all the CRUD operation. So I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call it EntityManager. And within that, I'm going to create, you guessed it, EntityManager interface .php, and I'm going to create a EntityManager class. .php, and this also got a factory EntityManager factory.php. And let's first implement the interface, because this is probably going to be one of the easier class to implement because it's only got one method. I'll say PHP declare strict types namespace, say magma, say liquid ORM, and it's going to be EntityManager. And say interface EntityManager interface. And the method that we're going to put in is going to be public function, and it's going to be called get crud. That is it. And actually we'll just set the return type, and it's going to be an object. I believe it's an object. So let's get to our main class, start implementing that. So declare strict types namespace magma, it's going to be liquid ORM, and it's going to be EntityManager. And say class EntityManager implements EntityManager interface. Right, so I need to put a constructor within this class. I'm going to say main constructor class and return void. I'm going to say public function construct, and I'm going to pass in the CRUD interface. Is that a good name? CRUD interface? Could we name it something better? Let's go with CRUD interface for now. it's a class that we've not created yet, and we're going to assign the variable or the argument to that. Sorry, we're going to type int crud interface to that crud variable, and we need to set a protected crud interface to that variable. It's just going to say var crud interface, and that's something we need to bring in, and that's going to be located within this entity directory. So I'm going to say magma liquid ORM EntityManager, and it's going to be a crud interface. Now again, we've not created this class yet, so we can actually go and create it. So it's going to be crud.php. I'm going to go crud interface.php. And we're going to come and list all the method that we want within this interface in a minute. So back to our manager, we want to pipe this property to this constructor argument. So this crud equal crud, and because this is a protected method, we need to return it in a method. We need to return that property within a method that we can access it outside of this class. So I'm going to say public function, and it's going to be get crud, and it's going to return this crud. Again, it says an object because we're returning the crud object, and that's as easy as it gets. That is as much code are we going to put in our EntityManager class. I'm just going to inherit the meta doc from the interface when we do come to put that in. We've not written anything yet, but we will put some description in. So I'm going to close that out. This is a very skinny class. There's only one method and a constructor in this class. So the next thing we need to look at is we need to start putting in all the method that we require in our interface class. So we're going to start implementing those. So we're going to say PHP declare again strict types equal 1 namespace magma, again capital M, magma liquid ORM, and we're within the EntityManager, and yeah, so I'm going to say interface, and it's crud interface. Now, there's a couple of methods that's not exactly crud related, but it's better served within this interface and within this class, and you'll see what I'm saying when we start implementing it. So the first one is going to be a public function, and it's going to be called get schema, and it's going to return a string. The second one is going to be public, and it's going to be get schema ID. That's also going to return a string. So let me explain what these two methods are. So when I say get schema, what I'm referring to is get the database table name, the name of the database table, and the get schema ID is get the name of the primary key column of that database table. So that primary key could be whatever it is that we define when we create our database table. We want to get that key. We want to get that key within this method, and you'll see how that works in a bit. Next method that we want is public function, and we want last ID, and this is the last return ID of our insert query statement, and again we want it to be an integer. So that's the free method that's not exactly CRUD related, but we need these methods in order to sort of like insert, create stuff in the correct table. So our first CRUD method is going to be create, right? And this is going to be return a bool, because create is going to return true or false. It will either create successfully or it fails. So it's going to return a bool, and this is going to take one argument, which is an array, and I'll call it fields, and I'll set it to a empty array. Now the second CRUD argument that we got is the R in CRUD, which is going to be the read method, and this is going to return an array. And this accepts multiple arguments. So the first one I'm going to set is an array, and it's going to be the selectors. I'm to set that to an empty array because it's optional. The second one is also an array, that's going to be the conditions, that's also optional. The third argument is also an array, and that's going to be the parameters for a query string. That is also optional. And the fourth argument we're going to put in is also an array, and that is going to be called optional. That's optional. And I think the fifth, I think that's it. I think it requires 4 arguments, and I think that's it. So we can actually break these down on separate lines. That's a PHP coding standard as well. This is allowed, so we're allowed to do stuff like this. But again, I don't think we need to in this particular interface class, because it's not. We can see all of it. So let's carry on. So the next method that we want to create is the U. So we got create read. So we'll say update, and that's going to be a bool as well. Just like the create method is going to either return true or false, with update that's the same. We either update successfully or we fail. And this method is going to accept 2 arguments, and the first is going to be the array, and this is going to contain an associative array of key value pair that we want to update. And set that to optional, and the second argument is going to be a string. This is going to be the primary key which we want to update by, right? The next one in our CRUD is our delete method, and just like what we've said when we're doing the query builder, I want to delete via an array rather than specify an ID. I want to delete via an array, so I could delete by whatever field that I desire. So it's going to be an array, and it's going to be conditions. That's going to be optional. Now that's all you need for your CRUD operation, but I'm going to go a couple of steps further, and I'm going to add an S onto my CRUD, and I'll call it CRUDs. And what the S is going to take care of is our search functionality. I'm going to say public function, I'm going to say search, and that's going to return an array of search results, and the arguments are going to be an array, and the first one's going to be selectors, so we can return an array of selected columns or fields or columns. That's going to be optional, and the second argument is an array, and that's going to be the search conditions, and that's also going to be optional. And next one is going to be public function, which is not part of the crud, which is just the raw query bit that we've implemented within our query builder. We're going to implement the method that can help us output custom query. I'm going to call this raw query, and I'm not going to set a return type on this just yet because I'm still unsure if I'm going to actually, or the best way to implement this. I'm going to leave it like that for now, but I know I'm going to need the argument, which is going to be a string. For the first argument is going to be the actual raw query, yeah, and the second argument is going to be an array of conditions for that query, and I'm going to set that to optional. And I think that's all the bits that we need in this particular interface for the time being. We just now want to go ahead and implement those code for these, implement these method. So back into our crud class, we're going to start build that out and say PHP declare strict types equal 1 or equal true, and namespace, I'm going to say magma. Yes, I got it right first time. Magma liquid ORM, and I'm going to say EntityManager, and yeah, that's it. So class crud implements that crud interface, and we're going to have a constructor within this method, within this class. So, but before that, I'm going to go ahead and create some properties that we are going to require. And the first is going to be, well, they're all going to be protected. It's going to be protected, and it's going to be our data mapper object, right? I'm going to say data mapper, because in order to sort of like use or use our crud function, we need that prepare statement that we got in our data mapper. So we need that to be part of this class, or need that to be something that we can access within this class. And the next one is going to be protected, and that's going to be our query builder. You see, we type int in the class onto this variable, right? And the next one is going to be a protected string. That's going to be our table name, the name of our table. Protected string name. Actually, it's not table name. We call it get schema. So we're going to go with the same naming convention. So we're going to call it table schema. That's a better name. And string, we're going to call this table schema ID. And I'm not going to initialize any of these properties. I'm just going to bring them down into our constructor and pipe them to the constructor arguments. So I'm going to say public function construct, and we're going to say data mapper. Again, we type int in data mapper, and you say query builder, wrong, to be a variable. Query builder, we've got a string, we've got table schema, and a string table schema ID. Then we can pipe them now. So this data mapper equal data mapper. So this query builder equal query builder. can say this table schema equal table schema. We can say this table schema ID equal table schema ID. So because these are protected method, we need to return them so we can use them outside of this class. So I'm going to say public function, I'm going to say get schema, and it's going to be a string. I'm going to say return this table schema, right? And the second one is going to be public, so it'll be similar, public get schema ID. That's going to be a string as well. I'm going to say return this table schema ID, and that's as simple as it is. Now for the third one that we add in our interface, which is this method, we're going to say public function last ID, and that's going to return an int. Correct that syntax error. And we're going to say return this data mapper, and we're going to say get class ID. And remember this method that we've created in our data mapper class, which is get last ID. So we're sort of like getting this method within our crud using this property, this data mapper property, right? So let's start implementing some of our crud method. Say public function, and the first one is create, and that return bool, and it accepts one argument which is an array, and it's called fields, and it's optional, right? So I'm going to wrap all of my crud method in a try catch block to catch any exception or any error. The first thing I'm going to define is a associative array. I'm going to say args, I'm going to store it within this variable, and I'm going to say table, say this get schema, which is this method right here, which returns the table name, right? Then we're going to define the type, and this is going to be our insert type, because create, we're inserting, and the fields is going to be fields, and that's the variable, that's the argument we're passing into this key, or the value for this fields, this field key is this fields variable, if that makes sense. Well, it should do. Why are we getting an error right here? So args, alright, there we go, that's gone, wasn't an error. So we're going to create a next variable, we're going to call it query. I'm going to say is equal to this query builder, and I'm going to say build query, and within that build query method we're going to pass that args in, that args variable in. And on this build query, remember what we said in our query builder, this is a chaining method, so we're going to chain on or insert query onto that method. If we take it back to the query builder, you see we got our build query method, which is what we're calling right here through this property, because we've now got access to that query builder object once we pass that in to our constructor, we then get access to all the method within that class. So we're referencing this build query method. We're passing in our argument right here. This is our argument, and we're rewriting some of the keys within that default list that we've got. So we've got table, which is empty, and we're setting it to get schema, which is our database table, and we're setting the type, which is insert, right? And the fields, we're setting the fields as the argument that's coming into this method, which is the fields. So all of our iteration that we've been doing in our create method, this is the field. So we're getting all the arguments from that variable. I'm hoping that's starting to make sense. Right, so where are we? So we've got query, this query builder, build query, pass that argument in and call the insert query on that method. Right, so we're going to say this data mapper, and we're going to call a persist method, which we have not created yet. And this method is going to take a couple of arguments. It's going to take that actual query that we've just built right here, and we're going to say this data mapper again, because this method is within this data mapper class, and it's going to be called build query parameters, and we're going to pass that fields argument in. I'm going to say if this data mapper num rows is equal to 1, meaning if we've got at least one record that's been inserted, then we're going to return true because that was successful. And we're going to use a throwable for now. We might change this depending on the behavior that it outputs. And we're going to say throw that throwable. Right? So you can see now some of our we're sort of like mapping methods from this class. So our data mapper contains this num row, which return the number of affected rows. So we're saying if at least one row was affected, then our insert was successful. So we're going to return true. Right? So there's two methods here that we have not yet created, which we need to create. And what we want to do actually, we want to actually go and create this method. So we need to go back to our data mapper class, data mapper, and where can we put these? We can put these at the bottom if we want. So we're going to say public function. I'm going to say build query parameters. And as I'm saying, this method, see what it returns. This method accepts two arguments. We only define one in our crud class, but it accepts two arguments. And the first is an array, which is the conditions. And the second is also an array, which is the parameters. And what we're going to do with this is we want to, if I take you back here, because this method will be used in different crud method, we want to actually sort of like merge any conditions and additional parameters together. So we're going to delegate that to this method in this class. and we're going to say return. It's going to return it. I'm going to say if isn't empty, parameters or isn't empty. We should say open parentheses isn't empty conditions, then we want to merge both conditions and parameters together. So if they're not empty, we want to merge them together. Now, else, just return the parameters. Alright, so if parameters and conditions are not empty, if they're not empty, we're going to merge them together of one big array. And if it's empty, if one of them is empty, we're just going to return the parameters. Hope that makes sense. And we call that method right here. And we're only specifying the one argument, which means it's only going to return the parameters. Again, I can maybe like mess around with the variable names, but again, we can do that when we come to refactor. And the second method that we have not created is this persist method. So if we go back to our data mapper class, we can actually create that. And it's a simple method. So I'm going to say public function persist. And as we've said over here, it takes in 2 arguments. And the first is a string. And that's going to be the query that we're passing in. And the second is an array, and that's going to be the parameters. Right? And we're going to say, we're going to wrap this into a try-catch block as well. Right, I'm just gonna do a throwable. Let's put this back up here. Again, we're gonna mess around with these exceptions as we go along. We'll change out and put in the one that suits best. And it's not really an exception, it's a throwable. I'm just going to throw that out. And in this method, I'm just going to return this prepared, which is our prepared statement that we define at the very top. Let me get that, which is this prepared method that we defined up here. We're going to pass that query in from our persist from our persist method, that argument, which is the SQL query, which is coming from our crud class. We're passing that in, that actual query that we'll build, we're passing that in to our prepare statement, and we're going to chain on the bind parameters method. On that bind parameters method, we're going to pass in the parameters, which should really be the fields, because that's what we're passing in. And again, remember what I said, that bind parameters is a chainable method because we're returning this. We're returning this, so it's chainable. So we're passing that parameters, and that parameters is what get passed to this bind values, which is this method up here, which bind or name parameters to whatever value is we've set those to. So we're going to chain the execute method onto this, because once we've prepared the query statement, we bind all the name parameters to the values, then we want to execute, right? And that is it for persist method, for our persist method. So we return this prepared, we're passing in that SQL query, we're binding the parameters, then we're executing the query to get us the result. But we won't do anything like fetch result nor anything here, because we could fetch, or we could fetch all, or we could fetch column, we could do anything. So we don't want to do that bit right here. We can do that bit somewhere else. So back to our crud. So we define a try catch block. We've override some of our query builders. We've override some of our SQL default array. We've override the type and the table and the fields. Right? I'm trying to make you understand what I'm doing. So we've override that by creating this associative array. We then pass that array into our build query method and then call it insert query on that method, right? Then we get our data mapper and we persist that query to our prepared statement. We pass that query in as an argument, which then gets filters down to this prepared method. Prepare the SQL or the SQL query, then bind the parameters, then execute the code. And we're saying if this data mapper have at least one affected row, then our insertion was successful. So we're going to return true. I really hope that makes sense, because it doesn't get any simpler than that. It's very simple in what it's doing, and all the work that we've been creating to help build this class, this is some of the implementation of all the hard work that we've been doing. So let's crack on. Let's public function read, and I said this is going to return an array, and it's got a body, and we're going to specify the arguments. I think there were 4 arguments and they're all an array. But let's make things a little bit easier. Let's just copy these out. It's not cheating, this is acceptable. Paste them in, and again try catch block. Just gonna put in our throwable. I'm just going to throw that out. Alright, so we've taken care of that bottom bit. Again, the implementation is going to be very similar to what we've done right here. So we're going to define a variable called args. I'm going to override some of the key value, or override some of the key within our SQL default, which is located within our query builder class. So I'm going to say table, I'm going to say this get schema, which is a method. I'm going to define the type as this is a select query, and we're going to define the selectors to the first argument that we've got in this method. And what else have we got in this? We're going to get the conditions. We're going to pipe it to the conditions argument. What else have we got? We got a params, which is what I was forgetting in our query builder class. I need to go in there and refactor that a bit. I'm going to pass in our parameters in our, which is our third argument within that method, and we got extras, which is going to be our optional. And we're going to make use of this optional when we come to do our repositories. You're going to see what we're doing with that. And again, I need to break it down a bit because it's gone off screen somewhat. And let's leave it for now. Let's crack on. I'm going to say query. I'm going to say equal this query builder build query, and pass that variable in. I'm going to call the select query method on that one. I'm going to say this that data mapper, and we're going to persist and pass that query in, that query string in, and what we did just data mapper. So we're going to pass that query in. I'm going to say this data mapper. I'm going to say build query parameters. But only this time we're going to make use of both arguments for this method. So we're going to pass in our conditions and our parameters. And what's going to happen is, as we've discussed, if we've got conditions and parameters, we're going to merge them together, which is what we're doing right here. And in this method, we've passed in both conditions and parameters, so they're going to get merged together as one big fat array that's going to be mapped to each name property before it gets executed. So again, we're going to say if this data mapper, I'm going to call the numRow method numRows, and say greater than 0, then we want to return this data mapper, and we want to return an array of results. Right, so we're saying if we've got more than one, or if we've got a result, more than 0 will indicate no result. But if we've got greater than 0, it means that we've got some result. So we want to return them as an associative array, which is what this is doing. Data mapper results. And again, this is something that we build in our data mapper class, which is this method right here is what we're calling results, which is going to fetch all the data. And that is it for our read method. The third method is going to be where are we? Our update. And it's going to be update, and that's going to be a bool. And as we said, we can just quickly get the arguments and paste them in. Again, that's allowed. And again, we're going to go with our try catch block. It's getting really late now. It's after 2 in the morning now. I think I'm going to wrap up after this method, and we'll pick up again in the morning. So try catch, and again we're going to do our throwable. I'm just going to throw that out. And again, implementations are the same. It's consistent is what we're after. Consistency. Table. I'm going to do this get schema. I'm going to say the type is going to be update, and we want to pass in the fields, and we also want to pass in the primary key. So I'm going to say primary key. I'm going to pass it in primary key, right? Then I'm going to say query is equal to this query builder. So build query, and it's going to accept that argument. I want to fetch the update query on that method, right? So I'm going to say this data mapper. I'm going to persist. You can see that this persist method is going to be in all of our crud operation. I'm going to pass a query in, and we're going to the second argument, which is going to be data mapper, and it's going to be build query parameters. I'm going to pass that fields in, right? I'll say if data mapper, let's say this, actually this data mapper num rows is equal to 1, then return true. Again, similar to our create method, if at least one row was affected, then we can say database was updated successfully, right? And let's quickly just create this delete method, and that's going to return a bool as well. Is that what we're set for? Let's just check this. That's going to return a bool as well, because again, true if you've been deleted, and false if it failed. It's going to return a boolean, and the argument is just conditions. And was that optional? Conditions was optional, yeah. So I'm going to say empty array. Again, try catch block. And do a throwable. Just gonna throw a throwable. And again, to define our array, we're going to set our table. I'm going to say this get schema. I'm going to say type is delete, and we've got some conditions which we're going to pass in conditions. I'm going to say this our query equal this query builder. I'm going to say build query args. Then I'm going to call that delete query method. And say this a lot of this. This is what object orientated programming is all about. A lot of this self. So yeah, this mapper persist, and passing that query. I'm going to say this data mapper. I'm going to say build query parameters, and we've only got the conditions to pass in, right? I'm going to say if this data mapper num rows was affected, which is equal 1, equal 1, then we're going to return true. Right, so if at least one row was affected, we're going to return true because it was successfully deleted. Right, and again, I should have logged out, but I'm going to do one last method that we've got, and it's going to be a public function search, and that's going to return an array, and this contains a couple of arguments. Let's copy that out, copy, paste, and again, it's so tedious, we could just copy this block of code and make the changes. So just going to change up type to search, which I don't think we add in our query builder. So we can say search, make that part of our query types. And what condition has this got? This got conditions, and it's got selectors. That's the next one. Selectors, and I'm going to say selectors, comma. And we just need the search query, which I don't even think we've got in our query builder. No, we've not even got the search query, but again, it is something that we're going to implement because we want our application to have search functionality. It's pretty important for application to have features like that, so ours are not going to be no exception. We want to have that functionality. So it's going to be a string, and I'm going to implement it later, but let's also put that within our interface. Let's just copy that. I'm going to call it search. I might as well just rewrite it myself. Cut that. Must be tired because I'm now starting to slur my typing even worse now. So it's going to be search query, and that's going to be that for that. Close that out. Query builder. We're going to implement this tomorrow. I'm going to close that out. Close that out. I'm going to close that out. We're going to come back to that in a bit as well. Not tonight, but in a bit. And now we got the result that we want. We need to say if number is greater than 0, if we've at least found one search result, we're going to again return this data mapper results. Right, return an array of search results. And I think that's going to be it for tonight. We're going to pick up back again tomorrow and crack on with the completion of our liquid ORM, so we can then move on to different parts of our framework, because as I've said, we've got quite a lot to do. So again, guys, thanks for watching. I hope you're getting some value from what I'm doing, and please like, share and subscribe to the channel. I'm going to leave links down in the description so you can jump onto GitHub and clone the project, download it, have a look through the source code, leave comments, tell me what you like, what you don't like, and so we can make all the changes together. So that's going to be it for tonight. I'm going to pick up again tomorrow, so stay tuned, be safe, God bless, good night.